What if a single delay decided the fate of millions of soldiers and changed the course of a continent? The delay before the Battle of Kursk was not a simple scheduling issue. It was the pivot upon which strategy, industry, and fate turned. Within weeks and months of that decision, entire armies were remade, front lines hardened, and the initiative in the east shifted irreversibly. This episode will look beyond tanks and casualty lists to examine why the attack was postponed repeatedly, how those delays affected both sides in concrete ways, and why every postponement added another brick to the Soviet defense. By the end, we will see that time itself became an invisible weapon, one that the Soviets used far more effectively than their opponents could imagine. To understand the delay, we first need to see what Kursk looked like on a map, and why both sides cared so intensely about it. The salient itself protruded into German-held territory like a blunt instrument of Soviet resistance, and its shape invited attacks from both flanks to pinch and destroy the bulge. The geography meant that Kursk was not just a tactical objective. It was a decision node for operational warfare, where rail hubs, road networks, and open steppe would determine how armored formations could be employed. When a theater looks like that, timing becomes as important as force size. And so, every delay resonated through planning rooms in Berlin and Moscow alike. On the German side, the plan was audacious and simple in outline. Operation Citadel would slice the bulge, trap Soviet forces, and restore the initiative on the Eastern Front. The idea appealed to the Wehrmacht because it promised a decisive breakthrough that could blunt Soviet offensives and relieve pressure elsewhere. But the operational clock was already running, and by the summer of 1943, the Germans were not what they had been 2 years earlier, with acute shortages of men, fuel, and operational tanks. Those material and mechanized shortfalls meant that Citadel could only succeed with precise timing, and any delay would turn a surgical strike into a blunt, costly engagement. Hitler's decisions were a central cause of delay, and his growing involvement in operational matters complicated plans at the highest level. Adolf Hitler became more controlling after Stalingrad, insisting on conservation of strategic assets and personal approval for major movements, which produced pauses in German momentum. Those pauses were not merely bureaucratic. They changed the tempo of planning and forced field commanders to wait for political permission, rather than press fleeting advantages. In warfare, waiting can be fatal when surprise is lost, and Hitler's interference repeatedly pushed timetables back at Kursk in ways that would prove costly. On the ground, German commanders disagreed about the timing and method of attack, and those disagreements created operational friction that further delayed the offensive. Manstein and Model had different philosophies about where to strike and how quickly to commit their panzer formations, which produced cautious compromises rather than bold consensus. Internal disputes meant that key units waited for reinforcements or reorganization, and in a contest where hours mattered, those waits allowed the Soviets to fortify and reposition. The argument over tempo was not academic. It determined how much surprise would remain when the first German shells fell. Intelligence played a paradoxical role in the delay because Soviet awareness and German uncertainty fed each other into a loop of caution. The Soviets had sources, captured documents, and partisan reports that alerted them to German intentions, and that clarity allowed them to plan layers of defense. At the same time, German reconnaissance intercepted limited Soviet movements, but could not guarantee blind spots had not been filled, and that lack of certainty encouraged postponements until conditions seemed more favorable. The intelligence cycle turned into a waiting game, where each side tried to outguess the other, and thereby change the timetable. While German leaders hesitated, the Soviets poured effort into transforming the Kursk salient into a fortress of layered defenses and lethal depth. Engineers, miners, and soldiers worked by night to create belts of anti-tank ditches, massive minefields, and interlocking fields of fire that would slow any armored advance. This was not ad hoc fortification, but industrialized defense in which every mine had purpose and every anti-tank gun was sighted to create kill zones. The more time the Soviets were given, the more they converted open steppe into a calculated gauntlet designed to bleed an attacker dry. Behind those fortifications, the Soviet Union was also rebuilding its industrial capacity and producing tanks in numbers that would astonish observers. The T-34 had been refined, spare parts had been stockpiled, and new brigades were moving westward, ready to counterattack when the time came. This industrial momentum mattered more than individual heroics because attrition at Kursk would be a contest of production as much as tactics, and delay allowed the Soviets to bring reserve formations and fresh armor to the battlefield. When the Germans finally struck, they faced not the exhausted units of spring, but newly provisioned forces tempered by defensive doctrine. German logistical problems compounded delay because fuel, ammunition, and trained crews were in shorter supply than the high commands admitted. The Eastern Front had stretched supply lines to the breaking point, and the attrition of 1942 and early 1943 left the Wehrmacht with fewer serviceable tanks than planners had counted on. Rail disruptions, partisan attacks, and Allied strategic bombing also interfered with the timely resupply of critical components, which meant that commanders often postponed major moves while waiting for replacement parts or fuel shipments. The result was a campaign planned on confident timetables, but executed under resource constraints that increased the propensity to delay. Weather was another underrated reason for postponements, because spring mud and the Rasputitsa could immobilize mechanized formations within hours and reverse tactical advantages. The Germans had learned at great cost that a month of bad weather could turn tanks into liabilities and roads into quagmires. Commanders on both sides watched the sky as much as maps, because a badly timed offensive could trap armored spearheads with no snug lines of supply. These meteorological realities made commanders conservative, and conservative choices meant that the initial date for Citadel slid repeatedly on the calendar. Stalin and the Soviet High Command were not passive recipients of German pauses. They used the delay with strategic intent and political calculation. Stalin insisted on conserving strategic reserves and refused to commit fully until defensive belts and reserve armies were in place and tested. This cautious patience was political as well as military, because the Soviet state could not risk a failed defense that would expose critical centers or invite German exploitation. The result was an iron discipline of waiting and preparation, which, given time, turned the salient into a fortified web rather than a weak bulge. For Germany, the delay had an immediate tactical cost, because the element of surprise faded and the enemy used the time to engineer kill zones. The initial plan depended on rapid penetration and the collapse of Soviet formations, but the extended timetable turned precise operations into grinding assaults. Every week of delay allowed minefields to be augmented, artillery to be rearranged, and reserves to be positioned, so that the Germans faced not isolated weak points but a deliberately prepared depth of fire. In that sense, delay converted an operational hope into a logistical nightmare for attacking units. Conversely, the delay favored the Soviets because it gave them time to practice integration between infantry, armor, and artillery in defensive roles. Soviet commanders refined layered defensive doctrines and synchronized counterattack plans during the months of waiting, which improved coordination under fire. The increased competence in combined arms meant that when German thrusts arrived, Soviet units could absorb shock and then smash the attacker with localized counterblows. Time here was not merely an ally, it was the material through which the Soviets turned raw numbers and heavy industry into tactical superiority on the ground. By the time the Germans launched the offensive in July of 1943, they discovered a battlefield that had been anticipated at every step, and their operational plans required adaptation on the fly. In several sectors, German spearheads encountered trenches, belts of anti-tank guns, and minefields that had been designed for maximum delay impact. The tactical surprise that Citadel needed had been largely eroded by weeks of preparation, and German units often found themselves advancing into meticulously arranged traps rather than open terrain. This shift drastically reduced offensive tempo and inflicted losses that German planners had not expected at the outset. Air power was another casualty of delay because the Luftwaffe had been attrited across earlier campaigns and could not achieve the air superiority German commanders hoped for at Kursk. The Luftwaffe's resources had been thinned by attrition over Stalingrad and the Western Front, meaning fewer effective close air support sorties. The Soviets used their time to build up fighter forces and coordinate air defense systems that further blunted German air efforts. Without uncontested air cover, German armored operations lost flexibility, and the delay thus contributed to attrition in three dimensions: land, air, and logistics. Operational plans changed because of the delay, and German staff officers had to recalibrate objectives and concentration of forces in real time. What began as a concentrated, narrow thrust evolved into phased attacks, with shifting shorepunk that tried to adjust to new Soviet defenses. These adaptations consumed time and force, and often diluted the potency of elite units by spreading them across multiple axes. In short, the delay forced operational improvisation that undercut the decisive quality Citadel had once promised. The psychological impact of delay on commanders is easy to underestimate, but waiting breeds doubt and risk aversion under pressure. German commanders accustomed to rapid maneuver found themselves second-guessing attacks and micromanaging columns, which slowed decision cycles at every level. On the Soviet side, confidence grew as fortifications held and reserves proved reliable, producing a psychological momentum that hardened defensive resolve. The interaction of doubt and confidence, amplified by time, shaped battlefield morale and the willingness of units to take either bold risks or stubborn stands. Tactically, the Soviets exploited the delay to refine specialized measures, such as deep minefields, anti-tank ambushes, and mobile counterattack units, designed to exploit German vulnerabilities. They learned how to channel armored attacks into predictable corridors, where focused defenses could destroy mechanized units. This approach made the front line more of a sieve than a simple barrier, catching tanks and then breaking the crews with concentrated artillery barrages and counterattacks. Those tactical evolutions were direct products of the months spent preparing a defense that was always meant to be patient and deadly. Strategically, the delay had monumental consequences because it meant that Kursk would become the last great German strategic offensive in the East, and that the initiative would pass permanently to the Red Army. Once Citadel faltered, German high command lacked the reserves and political cohesion to launch another offensive of comparable scale. The loss at Kursk signaled a transition from German operational mobility to strategic defense, and that transition reshaped the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. Delay had not only altered one battle, it had turned a strategic trajectory towards Soviet ascendancy that would not be reversed. The human cost of the delay is visible in casualty statistics and shattered towns, because prolonged defensive preparation invited battles of attrition that inflicted enormous losses on both sides. Thousands of soldiers died in protracted assaults against prepared positions, and equipment losses mounted into the hundreds of tanks and aircraft. These losses underscored that timing choices in war are not merely strategic abstractions, but moral decisions with tangible human consequences. The delay changed the nature of bloodshed at Kursk, from a quick breakthrough into a grinding, costly struggle that left deep scars across the landscape and communities. After the failure of Citadel, the Soviets seized the operational initiative and launched a series of offensives that pushed the front westward, turning defense into strategic attack. Operations Kutuzov and Rumiantsev followed, exploiting German weakness and converting the strategic pause into inexorable Soviet advances. These offensives were possible because the delay had created not only physical defensive works, but also strategic breathing room for the Soviet economy and reserves. That breathing room allowed Moscow to choose when and where to strike, which is perhaps the clearest measure of how time had become a decisive resource. One clear lesson from Kursk's delay is that intelligence and preparation can trump momentary tactical superiority if the defender uses time effectively. The Soviets turned awareness into infrastructure, and infrastructure into tactical advantage, which is a blueprint that military theorists study to this day. Another lesson is that denying an enemy the ability to shape the tempo of battle is as important as any weapon, because timing controls the effective concentration of force. In this sense, Kursk teaches that preparation, industry, and timing are often more decisive than immediate battlefield brilliance. Leadership lessons from the delay emphasize the peril of political interference in operational planning and the value of delegated authority in the field. Hitler's micromanagement and distrust of frontline commanders worsened delays, while Soviet centralized planning used those delays to prepare effectively. Modern commanders study Kursk because it shows how strategic impatience and micromanagement can squander opportunity, whereas disciplined patience coupled with industrial capacity and good intelligence can produce resounding strategic returns. The interplay of command decisions and logistical reality remains a central theme for military education. The legacy of Kursk's delay extends into doctrine and popular memory, because it reframed how modern armies think about defense in depth and the use of reserves. What was once a desperate Soviet improvisation became a studied model for combining mines, anti-tank guns, and mobile reserves. In popular terms, Kursk became less about heroics and more about engineering patience, which shaped how historians and militaries remember the Eastern Front. The idea that time can be wielded as an offensive resource by a defender lives on in analyses of asymmetric and conventional conflicts alike. More broadly, there is a philosophical twist to Kursk's delay. Patience in war can be an act of violence, just as much as impulsive assault. Waiting with intent reshapes the moral calculus of conflict, because planners trade short-term action for long-term structural advantage. This paradox that delay can both preserve lives and invite prolonged suffering forces a deeper reflection on how states choose to wage war and how measurement of risk and time is fundamentally political. Kursk forces us to ask when patience is prudence and when it is complicity in extended slaughter. In modern relevance, Kursk teaches that time coupled with production and information advantage often determines outcomes even more than battlefield genius. Contemporary military thinkers apply this lesson to cyber, economic warfare, and logistic planning, because the same logic holds. Whoever controls the tempo can often control the result, whether in hardware or data. The capacity to postpone or accelerate operations with coherent purpose shapes strategic realities, and that is why military planners study Kursk as a cautionary tale about rushed offensives and a promotional tale for deliberate preparation. If you look at the Battle of Kursk through the lens of delay, a clearer story emerges about power, patience, and industrial scale, and it is not one of simple battlefield heroics. The pause before Citadel allowed the Soviets to convert time into strategic superiority, and that conversion changed the course of the war. So when people ask whether timing matters in warfare, Kursk answers with a resolute yes, showing that delays are never neutral and are often decisive. Understanding that helps us better interpret not only history, but the mechanics of contemporary conflict as well. The consequences of the delay still echo in military education, because commanders must weigh the dialectic between seizing opportunity and preparing thoroughly. Kursk teaches that the right answer is rarely absolute, and that timing must be integrated into force planning from the start. That lesson applies to states with limited resources, where waiting to build resilience can sometimes achieve what immediate action cannot. The calculus remains difficult, but Kursk provides a powerful historical data point for making that decision. As a final thought, memory and myth often simplify Kursk into tales of tank numbers and casualty tallies. But the real story is deeper and more instructive. The delay before the battle reveals how complex systems of politics, logistics, weather, and psychology interact to create strategic outcomes that no single man or weapon can fully control. That complexity should humble us about simple explanations and remind us that history is often made in quiet rooms of patience as much as on noisy battlefields of action. If this perspective changed how you view time and strategy, then Kursk has done its work in revealing a hidden logic. If this gave you a new perspective on the Battle of Kursk and why delay mattered, consider how many modern conflicts hinge on the same variables of time and production. The interplay of patience and preparation remains a decisive factor in war, politics, and economics today. If this video helped reframe a familiar battle for you, hit subscribe for more historical analyses that look beneath the surface. Join us next time as we unpack another turning point, where time itself became the deadliest weapon on the battlefield.